Have you ever felt like you disappeared? Not physically, but psychologically. As if the person you've always known yourself to be, the story you've been telling about who you are, suddenly stopped making sense. The boundaries that separated you from everything else. The voice in your head that constantly narrates your life. The feeling of being a distinct individual moving through the world. All of it just dissolved. And for a moment, maybe just a fleeting second, or maybe longer, you weren't sure where you ended and where the rest of existence began. If you've experienced this, even partially, you've touched something that mystics have described for thousands of years, philosophers have theorized about, and modern psychology is only beginning to understand. Ego death, the temporary dissolution of the self, the moment when the person you thought you were ceases to exist, and what remains is pure awareness, without identity, without story, without separation. This is not a metaphor, it's not poetic language. It's a real psychological phenomenon that can happen during meditation, through psychedelic experiences, in moments of extreme crisis, or sometimes spontaneously without warning. And it is one of the most terrifying, most liberating, most misunderstood experiences a human being can have. Most people live their entire lives without ever questioning the fundamental assumption that they are a separate self. You wake up every morning as you. You go to sleep every night as you. There is a continuous thread of identity that connects yesterday's version of you to today's version. You have a name, a history, preferences, beliefs, fears, desires. All of this forms what we call the ego, the psychological structure that organizes your experience around the concept of I. But what if I told you that this sense of self, this feeling of being a distinct individual, is not as solid as you think? What if the ego is not a permanent feature of consciousness, but a construct, a pattern that the brain creates to navigate reality, but one that can be turned off? And what happens when it does turn off? What remains when there is no longer a you to experience anything? This is the territory of ego death. And if you're watching this video, it's because something in you already knows that the self you've been clinging to is not the whole story. Maybe you've had glimpses of it, maybe you're terrified of it, maybe you're desperately seeking it. But whatever brought you here, you're about to understand something that will change the way you see yourself forever. Because ego death is not just a spiritual concept or a drug-induced hallucination. It's a window into the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. And once you understand it, you can never go back to believing in the illusion of the separate self the same way again. Let's start with what the ego actually is, because you can't understand ego death until you understand what is dying. The ego is the psychological structure that creates the sense of I. It's the part of your mind that looks out at the world and says, "That's me, and that's not me." It draws a boundary between your body and the environment, between your thoughts and other people's thoughts, between your past and the present moment. It creates continuity, the feeling that you are the same person you were yesterday and will be tomorrow. The ego is what makes you feel like the author of your life, the one making decisions, the one in control. It's the voice in your head that comments on everything, judges, plans, remembers, worries. It's the story you tell about yourself. I'm the kind of person who likes this. I'm someone who struggles with that. I became who I am because of these experiences. The ego is not just your personality. It's the entire framework that organizes your subjective experience around a central point, the self. From a psychological perspective, the ego is necessary. It helps you function, make decisions, protect yourself, maintain relationships. Without it, you couldn't navigate the world. But here's what most people don't realize. The ego is not a thing. It's a process. It's not a fixed entity sitting somewhere in your brain. It's a pattern of neural activity, a habit of thinking, a way the brain organizes information. And like any pattern, it can be interrupted. Ego death is what happens when that pattern is disrupted. The brain stops organizing experience around the concept of I. The boundaries dissolve, the story stops, and what remains is raw, unfiltered awareness without a subject. There is still experience, sensations, thoughts, perceptions, but there is no one experiencing them. There is seeing but no seer. There is thinking but no thinker. There is existence but no individual existing. This sounds abstract, but the people who have experienced it describe it with striking consistency. They talk about a sense of unity, the feeling that they are not separate from anything, that the distinction between self and world was an illusion. They describe a loss of personal identity, not knowing their name, their history, who they were, or what they were supposed to be. They talk about timelessness, the collapse of past and future into an eternal present. And many describe a profound sense of peace, the relief of no longer having to be someone, no longer having to maintain the exhausting story of me. But it's not always peaceful. For some, ego death is terrifying, because when the self dissolves, so does the sense of control, safety, and meaning that the ego provides. Imagine for a moment that everything you've ever identified with, your memories, your personality, your beliefs, your body, suddenly feels like it's disappearing. You don't know who you are. You don't know where you are. There is no anchor, no reference point, just vast, impersonal awareness. For someone who has spent their entire life believing they are a separate self, this can feel like dying, and in a way it is. The person you were ceases to exist, even if only temporarily. Carl Jung understood this. He spoke about the dissolution of the ego as a necessary stage in the individuation process, the journey toward psychological wholeness. He warned that confronting the unconscious, facing the parts of yourself you've repressed, can lead to a temporary disintegration of the ego structure. The self you thought you were has to die so that a more authentic, integrated self can emerge. But this death is not literal. It's symbolic. It's the death of illusion, the death of the false self, the death of the persona you created to survive in the world. And this is the paradox. Ego death is not the end of you. It's the end of the story you've been telling about you. The awareness remains. Consciousness continues. What dies is the identification, the belief that you are only this body, this mind, this collection of thoughts and memories. And when that belief dissolves, what's revealed is something much larger, not a bigger ego, but the space in which all experience arises, the awareness that exists before and beyond the sense of self. But here's the critical point. Ego death is temporary. The ego doesn't die permanently, it comes back. Because the brain is wired to create a sense of self, it's a survival mechanism. You need an ego to function in the world. The person who has experienced ego death doesn't become a permanently egoless saint. The self reconstructs itself. The boundaries reform. The story starts again. But something has changed. Because now there's a knowing, a direct experience that the self is not as solid as it seemed, that the I you take for granted is a construction, not a fundamental truth. And this changes everything. Because once you've seen through the illusion, even once, you can never fully believe in it the same way again. You know that the ego is something the mind does, not something you are. And that knowledge, even if the ego comes back, creates a kind of freedom, a loosening of the grip, a spaciousness that wasn't there before. If this is making sense, if something in you recognizes this, click the subscribe button. Because what we're exploring here goes deeper than most content you'll find. This is not surface-level self-help. This is the core of what it means to be conscious, and there's much more to uncover. Now let's talk about how ego death actually happens, because it's not something you can simply decide to experience. The ego is not going to voluntarily dissolve itself. It's built to preserve itself, to maintain the illusion of continuity and control. So ego death requires something that disrupts the normal functioning of the ego structure, something that interrupts the pattern. For some people, it happens through intense meditation practice. When you sit in silence for hours, days, or weeks, observing the mind without engaging with it, the ego structure begins to loosen. The constant stream of thoughts that reinforces the sense of I starts to quiet. The identification with the body weakens. The boundaries become less defined. And if the practice goes deep enough, there can be moments when the self completely dissolves. What remains is pure awareness, witnessing itself, with no one doing the witnessing. And this changes everything. Because once you've seen through the illusion, even once, you can never fully believe in it the same way again. You know that the ego is something the mind does, not something you are. And that knowledge, even if the ego comes back, creates a kind of freedom, a loosening of the grip, a spaciousness that wasn't there before. Now let's talk about how ego death actually happens. Because it's not something you can simply decide to experience. The ego is not going to voluntarily dissolve itself. It's built to preserve itself, to maintain the illusion of continuity and control. So ego death requires something that disrupts the normal functioning of the ego structure, something that interrupts the pattern. For some people, it happens through intense meditation practice. When you sit in silence for hours, days, or weeks, observing the mind without engaging with it, the ego structure begins to loosen. The constant stream of thoughts that reinforces the sense of I starts to quiet. The identification with the body weakens. The boundaries become less defined. And if the practice goes deep enough, there can be moments when the self completely dissolves. What remains is pure awareness, witnessing itself, with no one doing the witnessing. But meditation is a slow path, and not everyone has the discipline, time, or inclination to sit in silence for years. So ego death also happens through other means. Psychedelics, for example, are one of the most common triggers. Substances like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and ayahuasca can temporarily disrupt the brain's default mode network, the neural system responsible for maintaining the sense of self. When this network is suppressed, the ego structure collapses, and the person experiences the dissolution of identity, the loss of boundaries, the sense of unity with everything. This is why people who take psychedelics often describe it as the most profound experience of their lives. Because they have touched something beyond the ego, something that the normal waking mind cannot access. But it's also why these experiences can be terrifying. Because the dissolution of self, when it happens suddenly and without preparation, can feel like death. And in a way, it is. The person you were before the experience is not the same person who comes back. Ego death can also happen spontaneously, during moments of extreme crisis, trauma, or spiritual awakening. Sometimes the mind reaches a breaking point where the ego structure can no longer hold. The story collapses, the self shatters, and what emerges is raw, unfiltered consciousness. This can happen during near-death experiences, during profound loss, during moments of overwhelming beauty or terror. The common thread is that the normal functioning of the ego is interrupted, and the mind is forced into a state where the self is no longer the organizing principle of experience. But regardless of how it happens, the experience itself follows a recognizable pattern. First, there is a loosening of identity. The person begins to feel less attached to their name, their history, their personality. Who they thought they were starts to feel distant, unreal. Then there is a dissolution of boundaries. The sense of being a separate individual starts to fade. The distinction between self and other becomes unclear. There is no longer a clear dividing line between inside and outside, between me and the world. As this happens, time often collapses. The past and future, which are constructs of the ego, lose their significance. There is only the present moment, vast and eternal. Memory may become inaccessible. The person may not remember who they are, where they came from, or what they were doing before. The narrative structure that organizes experience into a coherent story breaks down, and then, if the dissolution goes all the way, there is a moment of complete ego death. The sense of I vanishes. There is no one there. There is only awareness without a subject, pure consciousness, witnessing itself. Some describe it as infinite space, others as nothingness, others as everything all at once. But the common thread is the absence of self. There is experience, but no experiencer. There is existence, but no individual existing. This state doesn't last. It can't. The brain will eventually re-establish the ego structure. The self will reform. The boundaries will return. But the memory of that dissolution remains. And for many people, it is the most significant experience of their lives, because it proves, not intellectually but experientially, that the self they've always believed in is not a fixed, permanent reality. It's a construct, a pattern, something the mind creates, and something the mind can let go of. But here's where it gets complicated, because not everyone who experiences ego death interprets it the same way. For some, it's a spiritual revelation, proof that consciousness is fundamental and the individual self is an illusion. For others, it's a psychological phenomenon, a temporary disruption of brain function with no metaphysical significance. And both interpretations can coexist, because ego death is not one thing. It's a spectrum of experiences ranging from a slight loosening of identity to a complete and total dissolution of self. What matters is not the interpretation, but the impact. Because ego death, when it happens, changes people. It changes the way they relate to themselves, to others, to existence itself. The person who has experienced the dissolution of self cannot go back to taking the ego for granted. They know, on a level deeper than thought, that the I they cling to is not the whole story, and that knowing, even if the ego returns, creates a kind of space, a freedom, a lightness that wasn't there before. And this is where the real work begins. Because the challenge is not just having the experience, the challenge is integrating it, understanding what happened, allowing it to transform you without getting lost in it. Because ego death, as powerful as it is not the end. It's a doorway, a glimpse of something beyond the self. But you still have to live in the world. You still have to function. You still have to relate to others, make decisions, navigate reality. And that requires an ego. The question is, can you have an ego without being completely identified with it? Can you function as a self without believing that the self is all you are? Can you live in the world as an individual while knowing, at the deepest level, that the individual is a construct? This is the paradox of ego death. And this is what we'll explore next. Because the real transformation doesn't happen during the dissolution. It happens after, when you come back, when the ego reforms. And you have to decide what to do with the knowledge that it was never as real as you thought. So, what happens after ego death? You come back. The self reconstructs itself. The boundaries reform. The voice in your head starts narrating again. You remember your name, your history, your responsibilities. The ego returns because it has to. You can't live in a state of permanent dissolution. The brain is wired to create a sense of self, and it will continue to do so whether you like it or not. But something is different. You've seen behind the curtain. You've experienced the absence of self, and you can't unsee it. The person who returns is not the same person who left. Because now there's a knowing, a direct, undeniable experience that the self you've always taken for granted is not as solid as it seemed. It's a pattern, a construction, something the mind creates. And that changes everything. For some people, this is liberating. The return of the ego feels lighter, more flexible. They no longer take their thoughts so seriously. They don't identify as strongly with their emotions, their story, their personality. There's a space between awareness and the self, a gap that wasn't there before. They can observe the ego doing its thing, creating identity, drawing boundaries, telling stories without being completely consumed by it. This is what some spiritual traditions call witnessing consciousness, the ability to be aware of the self without being the self. But for others, the return is difficult, because once you've tasted the freedom of egolessness, the ego can feel like a prison. The boundaries feel suffocating. The story feels false. The constant narration of the mind feels exhausting. There's a sense of loss, a grief for the spaciousness that was there during the dissolution. And this can create a kind of spiritual crisis where the person feels trapped between two worlds. They can't fully return to the ordinary sense of self, but they also can't permanently transcend it. This is where integration becomes critical. Because ego death is not the goal. It's a tool, a catalyst, a momentary glimpse of something beyond the self. But the real work is learning to live with that glimpse, learning to function in the world with an ego while no longer being enslaved by it. And this requires wisdom, patience, and a deep understanding of what the ego actually is. Carl Jung spoke about this in terms of integration. He believed that the goal of psychological development is not to destroy the ego, but to integrate it into a larger whole. The ego is necessary. It's the part of you that interfaces with the world, that makes decisions, that protects you. But it's not the entirety of who you are. It's one part of a much larger system, what Jung called the self with a capital S, the totality of conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, individual and collective. Ego death, from a Jungian perspective, is the moment when the ego is forced to confront its own limitations, when it realizes that it is not in control, not the center of the psyche, not the author of existence. And this confrontation is necessary for growth. Because as long as the ego believes it is everything, it remains inflated, rigid, defensive. But when it experiences its own dissolution, it humbles itself. It recognizes that it is part of something larger. And in that recognition, it can finally integrate into the whole. But this integration is not automatic. It doesn't just happen because you've had an experience of egolessness. It requires conscious effort. It requires you to take the insight from the dissolution and apply it to your daily life. To notice when the ego is tightening, when it's defending, when it's clinging to its story, and to gently loosen that grip. Not by trying to destroy the ego, but by recognizing that it's not the whole picture. This is the paradox. You need the ego to function, but you also need to see through it. You need to be able to operate as a self without believing that the self is all you are. And this is not easy, because the ego is persistent. It will reassert itself. It will tell you that the experience of dissolution was just a hallucination, a trick of the brain, something you imagined. It will try to make you forget. It will rebuild the walls, reinforce the boundaries, restart the story. And you will let it. Because you have to. You have to live in the world. You have to relate to people, pay bills, make plans. You can't walk around in a state of permanent egolessness and expect to function. But the difference is, now you know. You know that the walls are not as solid as they seem. You know that the story is just a story. You know that the self is a construction, not a fundamental truth. And that knowledge, even if the ego comes back, changes how you live. You become less reactive. Because you're no longer so identified with your thoughts and emotions. You see them arising, you feel them, but you don't believe they define you. You become less defensive. Because you're not as invested in protecting the image of who you think you are. You become more present. Because you're not constantly lost in the narrative of past and future that the ego creates. You become more compassionate. Because you realize that everyone else is also trapped in the illusion of a separate self, and that their suffering comes from that same illusion. This is the gift of ego death, not the experience itself, but the transformation it catalyzes. The ability to live in the world as an individual while knowing that individuality is not the ultimate truth. To have an ego without being enslaved by it. To be someone without forgetting that, on a deeper level, you are also no one. And this is where the spiritual traditions and modern psychology converge. Because whether you interpret ego death as a mystical experience or a neurological phenomenon, the outcome is the same. A loosening of identification. A recognition that the self is not as solid as it seems. A shift from being completely lost in the ego to being able to observe it, question it, and ultimately transcend it without destroying it. But there's a danger here too. Because the experience of ego death can be so powerful, so profound, that some people become addicted to it. They chase it. They want to go back to that state of dissolution, to feel that freedom again. They take more psychedelics, meditate obsessively, push themselves to the edge, trying to recreate the experience. And this is a trap, because the point is not to permanently dissolve the ego. The point is to see through it once, deeply enough that you can never fully believe in it again. Chasing ego death is still an activity of the ego. It's the ego trying to transcend itself, which is a contradiction. The ego cannot destroy itself. It can only be seen for what it is, a useful tool, a necessary structure, but not the totality of who you are. And once you've seen that, once you've experienced the space beyond the self, the work is not to go back there. The work is to bring that insight into the ordinary world of ego and identity in everyday life. Because the real transformation is not in the dissolution. It's in the integration. It's in living as a person who knows they are not just a person. It's in functioning as a self that is aware of itself as a construct. It's in playing the game of identity without forgetting that it's a game. And this, ultimately, is what ego death teaches. That the self is not the enemy. It's not something to be destroyed or transcended. It's something to be understood, recognized, integrated. The ego is a tool, not a prison. But you can only know this if you've experienced what it's like to be without it, even for a moment. Because only then do you realize that you are not your ego. You are the awareness in which the ego appears, and that awareness is vast, boundless, and free. So if you've experienced ego death, or if you're drawn to it, or if you're terrified of it, know this. It's not the end. It's a beginning. It's the moment when the illusion cracks, and you get a glimpse of what's beyond. But the journey doesn't end there. It begins. Because now you have to live with that knowledge. Now you have to integrate it. Now you have to figure out how to be human, while knowing that humanity is not all you are. And that is the real work. Not the dissolution, but the return. Not the death, but the rebirth. Not the absence of self, but the presence of awareness that sees through the self without destroying it. This is the path. And if you've made it this far, it's because something in you is ready to walk it. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. And truth, once glimpsed, can never be fully ignored. If this resonated with you, leave a comment. Write, "I see through the illusion," not for me, but for you. Because naming it makes it real. Claiming it makes it yours. And this could be the first step toward a life that's no longer enslaved by the story of who you think you are. And don't stop here. Keep watching. The next video is waiting. It goes even deeper. Because this journey doesn't end. It only deepens, and you're just getting started.